Great. It's smart to hear you describe me as a former mathematician. I think once you've done that damage to yourself, you're always a mathematician. But anyway, so I want to talk about something which is kind of, it's a sort of an assertive thing. In fact, it was, at a certain point, I will feel like I'm arguing back against a critical stance that I once heard Cable voice about this proposal. But I'm feeling these days that live in the US, and I'm feeling these days that we need sort of more muscular policies for the public good. So this is I'm going to make a proposal which is requiring a little bit of assertiveness, but I hope it will not be impossible. And this is basically a version of a blog post I wrote for the OER and Beyond blog, which unfortunately was hacked and so is down from the net at the moment. Anyway, so I'm in the land of the people in Colorado, and my usual land acknowledgement. Here's a legal acknowledgement. I'm not a lawyer. Even if I were a lawyer, I would not be your lawyer. Nothing. I'm going to talk about legal things, but nothing in this presentation should be construed as legal advice. I mostly know about U.S. legal situations, even though I'm not a lawyer. So how much this pertains outside the U.S. is unclear to me. But I think that if we make sort of muscular policies, no matter what the legal framework is, something like this might work in other contexts. So let's see. So as I was saying, I like a more muscular policy for the common good. I used to be part of the American Association of University Professors. I love its positions on things like, in this quote, institutions of higher education are conducted for the common good and not to further the interests of either the individual teacher or the institution as a whole. The common good depends on the free search for truth and its free expression. So I've worked with the AUP. I just think it's great, putting forward the common good. And I worked with the AUP, not as much as I with Creative Commons, but a fair bit over the years. I've written several articles for Academe, their magazine. I convinced them always to use a CC license on the articles I wrote for them, which is I'm the only one who bothers to do that with Academe, but they accepted. I wrote a piece fairly recently with another Jonathan, my friend Jonathan Reese from my former institution in Colorado. And we were talking about online education, and we said make sure your handbook clearly supports the academic exception to the works for hire copyright doctrine. So, and if you're, and you can read the rest of this quote if you want. So I want to talk a little about some of the issues raised in this quote: the works for hire copyright doctrine, the academic exception to the works for hire doctrine, and what this has to do with tenure line versus contingent faculty, and how CC licenses can help. So let me remind you, from the US, the Copyright Act is 17 US Code. The definition says a work for hire is a work prepared by an employee within the scope of his or her employment, plus some other complicated thing about sound recordings. So basically, when you're working for someone, if you do work, in the process of your work, your employer owns the copyright of that work. That was the definition of work for hire, but then the ownership of copyright in section 207 of 17 USC says that works made for hire, the copyright is owned by your employer. That's the default. So if you're an employee, your works are owned by your employer unless there's a specific exception. So I think the consequence is that most OER are aced. I'm trying to promote the use of the verb to ace. It stands for adopt, adapt, and create, because we use it all the time in the OER world. I think most OER are aced by academic employees in the course of their employment. And so by the default from copyright law, all of those things are owned by our institutions. And so we should not be able to put them under Creative Commons licensing, right? Well, maybe that clause I quoted says, unless the parties have agreed otherwise. And you have to look in your employment contract is the bottom line. Many employment contracts have something which is often called the traditional academic exception to the works for hire doctrine. Some of them don't. And the default, if it's not explicitly mentioned in your contract, is you don't get protection. So what do the contracts actually say? So globally, I don't know. I know the works for hire changes a lot from country to country. I don't know what it is in some of the Nordic countries. They have almost the opposite of what we have in the US. Anyway, there's a recent publication by the marvelous Lindsay Gum and William Cross that studies copyright ownership. They don't really answer the observations I've made anecdotally. They do a study. I'm just talking about anecdote. But in my experience, the anecdotes from Colorado, USA, where I have worked for a long time, the situation is tenure line faculty usually keep all of their copyrights. Other IP like patents are kind of complicated. If you work for a research institution, probably your contract says you have to profit share with your patents. even tenure-line faculty may not have complete copyright control in special circumstances. If there's a big online initiative at University X, they may say, and all the materials are being developed under copyright for institution X. Non-tenure-line faculty, such as at my former institution, rarely keep their copyrights. Whoops, sorry. IP policies are highly reactive to external forces like an initiative to start online education, or a grant that comes in that has a requirement for CC licensing will change everyone's minds really, really quickly. The policies, however, are a horrific mess. I'm not a lawyer, but I've read the policies and they're just self-contradictory. They're illogical. They get changed all the time. My former institution, my employment contract had a little line that said, if the board of governors of the Colorado State University system chooses to change any part of this contract at any time for any reason, that new thing will apply to you. And I asked my mom, who's a retired judge, can they just change my employment contract whenever? And she said, sure. So that kind of thing may exist. Anyway, the consequence of this is there's a ton of material produced by adjuncts and other contingent faculty and some tenure-line faculty, which is owned, the copyright is owned by their employers. As a consequence, think about the situation of road warrior adjuncts. If you're teaching at several different institutions, you write a test for intro to composition at institution A, you go down the street to institution B, often you're teaching the same course. You're not allowed to use that same document you wrote in the new institution. You wrote it, but the copyright is owned by the previous institution. So that's kind of crazy. So how about we coerce them? So here's my modest proposal. In all cases where copyrights over pedagogical materials are owned by the employing public educational institution at any level, because of a works for hire situation, those materials should be released with an OER compatible, so not the non-derivatives consequent, a Creative Commons license. And with the specification, the attribution should mention the actual author. This could be done by institutional policies, by public education regulators, or state law across the state. It has the flavor of open access movement, which says publicly funded research should appear in publicly accessible journals, which is used in federal grant giving in the United States. It's also related to something in the patent law situation called the Bayh-Dole Act. So it's not unheard of to be this coercive. I told this idea once to Cable, and Cable said, we don't like to be coercive, to coerce people to be open. I'm sorry, Cable, you're my straw man today. I actually have no problem with coercing people, with coercing people to be open. And I think that it's interesting to compare this to works of this federal government employees. So at the service academies, I live in the same town as the U.S. Air Force Academy. Those people are federal government employees. None of their works are copyrightable at all. So I have less modest versions of this that say everyone at public or private should do this. And how about everything, not whether or not it's works for hire, should be, if you work in higher education, your curriculum materials should be openly licensed. I think we should ask for that, and we should make a norm where that is something that people believe in, even if it's hard to make as part of regulations. Anyway, sorry, that was super quick, but that's my muscular proposal.